Half a year from now I will marry you. I promise. We'll send my wife to a hospice or to my daughter in Canada. If she resists, I'll make her mentally ill. Dr. Manson will take care of that. He has pills that will turn anyone into a vegetable. Even with her IQ, she'll never guess we locked her up in a madhouse. The restaurant will be mine. I'll make you the chef, my husband says to the woman whose voice is both horribly familiar and unbearably hateful. I am sitting in a closet while they make love in my son's bedroom. If you're listening, you'll soon discover that on the channel Her Karma there are no boring stories. Hit subscribe so you don't miss a new confession from a woman who doesn't know how to lose, and knows how to make revenge look elegant. My name is Destiny, and right now I'm going to explain how I ended up in that damn closet. Let's get one thing straight, I'm not the kind of woman who sneaks into someone else's house for kicks. I'm not that wild. But I do keep a spare key to my son Michael's apartment because years ago, when he was 5 and afraid of storms, I promised him I would always be able to get to him. He gave me that spare key, God help his sweet naive heart. Tonight I used it like a thief, but not to steal, no, to surprise him. I'd spent the day fluffing and frosting and micromanaging a surprise party, banners, the perfect playlist, his aunt's potato salad, the works. I even invited his friends. I imagined him stepping in, the lights flipping on, the room erupting with surprise, and his embarrassed, sheepish little grin. The kind of grin that used to melt me. Instead, the man who let himself through the door at 9:30 was not my son. It was Bob. My husband. My supposed husband of 32 years, who had once sworn to hold my hand through whatever life threw at us. He used to kiss the tops of my hands and call me Destiny like it was a promise. Tonight he called me nothing because I wasn't there. He was a whisper in the doorway, all cologne and impatience, and with him was a voice that jumped me back to a dorm lounge in 1986. The closet was small and hot. I slipped inside the cheap IKEA wardrobe in Michael's spare room and shut the door so gently you'd think I was tucking myself in. I told myself I'd peek, apologize for the intrusion, and be gone. I'd bring out the cake and turn the lights on at exactly the right second. That was the plan until those words, those monstrous, careless promises, spooled across the dark between their bodies and me. There's a peculiar clarity that comes when you're pressed against a wooden panel and the world you thought you knew is being meticulously dismantled 10 feet away. Bob was saying things I'd only ever imagined men were capable of on cable news, cold, premeditated, criminally practical. We'll send my wife to a hospice or to our daughter in Canada, he whispered, the words sliding off his tongue like change in a slot. If she resists, I'll make her mentally ill. Dr. Manson will take care of it. Then he laughed, a short, pleased sound, as if he'd just booked a restaurant table for dessert. My heart did something shameful, it didn't break. It rattled, then hardened into something sharp. I heard the scrape of a chair, the way his sleeve whispered along her cheek. The woman's laugh was quieter, full of the kind of confidence born of having been courted before. I could not place it at first. It nagged at the back of my skull like a song I half remember. Then, like a camera finding focus, a face from my 20s snapped into place, Elise. Elise, my old college friend, the girl who borrowed my eyeliner and never returned a textbook. We were young and bright together once, and for a while she'd been a name that lived in the soft corners of memory. She'd dated Bob before I did. They broke up. 6 months later he started taking me to coffee and then to dinner and then to the Reverend. I married him when we were 26, trusting his hands and his laugh. And now, 40 years on, Elise's voice, so familiar I could have hummed the cadence of it, lay across the mattress where she and my husband tangled. She sounded older, of course, smoother in all the places life had sanded raw. But it was her. My college friend, the one who'd once confided secrets about boys and leave-taking. My college friend who apparently liked the smell of my husband's shirts. I could have sprang out, thrown open the door, screamed like a banshee and called the whole town to see who'd mend my broken heart. I could have called the police. I could have stamped and scolded and demanded answers. I did none of those things. Because I'd heard the part about Dr. Manson and his pills and the hospice and the restaurant, and because I wasn't ready to be token spectacle. I needed evidence. I needed the right kind of justice, swift, smart, and with a splash of theatrical satisfaction. So I stayed. I listened. I catalogued every thrum of their conversation. They spoke in those banal, casual tones lovers use when they're certain each other's loyalty is a given: names for restaurants, plans for expansions, dates. "When we marry," Bob murmured, "in 6 months," and my stomach turned. Elise answered with a promise I hadn't expected to hear, the kind of quiet that suggested complicity. There was also the obscene business talk. The restaurant, our restaurant, my father's legacy, the place that smelled like simmered onions and garlic in my family for 3 generations, was theirs on paper in 2 sentences. "I'll make you the chef," he told Elise. "You'll run the back, I'll take care of the front. We'll transfer the lease when the will is settled." The nausea that had been building in my throat had a taste now, bile sweetened with betrayal. At some point, while they were rumbling on about leases and menus, my mind tripped across a memory: Elise in a faded jean jacket on a campus bench, the 2 of us sharing a cigarette behind the library, comparing quarter-life plans. How did she get here? How had someone who once cried about boy troubles and finals learned how to plant a man like a flag on the ruins of another woman's life? I pressed my forehead against the thin wood. I felt ridiculous and dangerous all at once, the way a cat must feel before pouncing on a raccoon that has outstayed its welcome. I thought about the cake cooling on Michael's counter. I thought about the string of paper lanterns I'd bought and the flyer I'd sent to his friends. They were on their way. At any second the doorbell could ring for a party that was supposed to be for a son, not a betrayal. The scene unfolding in the bedroom would be interrupted by laughter, balloons, and the surprised face of a man who, I imagined, would be furious in a way that could clean this whole mess with one righteous blast. But that would be messy. And messy is for the inexperienced. I am not inexperienced. I am destiny. A sound, Bob laughing softly as if he'd just solved a crossword, Elise replying, "Soon, darling. When your wife is somewhere safe," and then footsteps, his, closer to the closet than they ought to have been. My pulse went from simmer to boil. I had to decide, right then, whether to bolt and expose them to the world like a live wire, or to fold this small, private outrage into something strategic. I didn't move. I held my breath and waited for the rest of the scene to unravel, because revenge, like a good sauce, needs time to reduce. I waited until the mattress quieted and the city sounds outside Michael's windows took over: distant horns, the steady hum of a subway train that always sounded like a neighbor clearing his throat. Bob hummed under his breath, a little tune he used when he was pleased with himself. Elise sighed. I could hear the shower start, the familiar metallic staccato, the way water sounds like it's washing away not just dirt but responsibility. That's when I slid out of the wardrobe. Someone should invent a medal for sneaking with dignity. I shimmed down the narrow hallway in socks, the cake cooling in its box like an accused accomplice on the counter. The apartment smelled of lemon oil and my son's cologne that had never quite left his things. On the bedroom nightstand lay a phone, Bob's phone, a square island of temptation. He'd left it face down. How generous of him. Coincidences line up when the universe is rooting for you. I popped the SIM card out of my little kit and, like the old tech teacher I once pretended to be in PTA meetings, I navigated his device. There was no dramatic password. He never used face unlock, too showy. He trusted muscle memory more than security. Maybe because he didn't think he had anything to hide, or he thought his lies were better dressed than mine. I installed a small app, nothing that would turn his phone into a military satellite, just enough to record calls and send me a copy. Call it cheap justice. Call it savvy grandmothering in the digital age. I watched the app light up and felt like a witch stirring a very modern cauldron. The first fragments that popped through were a geography of treachery, brunch reservations, mentions of the transfer, and that obscene little map of a future where my life would be boxed into someone else's care plan. I took screenshots with hands that didn't tremble as much as I'd feared. I saved every word. He had been careful. His messages weren't in plain sight, He used code in conversations and labeled Elise and his contacts under a ridiculous alias, Station Maintenance and Friends. If you didn't know to read it as station with an ironic space, you'd miss the joke. He thought he was clever. He always did. For a brief, honest second I almost laughed. The audacity. The small, ridiculous theater of it. He'd once written me love notes in the margins of my books, now he wrote deceit in the margins of his phone. I felt like a detective in one of those novels Michael reads, except my protagonist had lipstick on and a tendency to burn garlic bread like a declaration of war. The first conversation I captured was a soft, conspiratorial whisper that chilled me more than 1,000 winters. Bob was talking about Dr. Manson, the name again, arranging supplements, phrased as vitamins. He used words like stabilize and progressive the way a man arranges furniture, a little to the left, a little to the right, until the room looks right for someone else's life. Elise giggled in the background like a bell with no conscience. He's cautious, Elise said. We need him compliant. Not angry, not suspicious. Just manageable. You'll have the place, Bob answered. Once the will's muddied and she's declared incapable. The rest was a collage of small logistics, a check here, a whispered contact number there, a promise that made me colder than ice. In 6 months, he said, like a man dating a calendar. We'll be married. You'll be chef. I'll handle the paperwork. If betrayal were a currency, he'd cashed all my years in for a life of sauté pans and clandestine dinners. I felt trickles of heat behind my eyes, anger, sure, but also that particular gratitude for being anything but ordinary. Ordinary people would have called the cops then and there. Ordinary people would have screamed and been done. Me? I had my channel, my little corner of the internet where I told truths dressed as tall tales. I had a family I loved and a plan that would not leave the stage to chance. I saved the audio files and copied the messages onto a thumb drive tucked inside my bra like a secret talisman. The device hummed against my ribs and felt absurdly precious. It was evidence, and evidence tastes better than vengeance alone. I slid the phone back where I'd found it, face down on the nightstand, and walked out into the night. Back in my car, I drove like someone going to confession and then to a poker game, fast and purposeful. I called Dr. Manson in my head a dozen times, not because I thought such a monster would answer, but because naming the devil takes some of his power. I went straight to a deli that had late hours and a notary across the street with a neon open sign that winked like a conspirator. I didn't think, I executed. I hadn't slept properly for nights. My hands were steady as if they were used to holding metal trays in a busy kitchen. The notary was a woman with a face built for bearing bad news and a stamp that smelled of bureaucracy. I rewrote my will there, right at the corner table where couples came to sign divorce papers in between bites of pastrami. I made it simple and severe, the restaurant to Michael, the house to Claire, my daughter in Canada, and Bob, beloved in his role as husband, would receive nothing beyond the memories he already spent. I added a clause that made my son executor and gave him temporary power if I were declared incapacitated mysteriously. The notary didn't blink. Papers were paper, people arrange papers to feel safe. Signing the documents felt like putting a new lock on a life. I thought then about secrets and how they're stored in places where you least expect them, phone contacts labeled as maintenance, the inside of a wardrobe, the bottom drawer of a cookie tin. I thought of Elise's laugh, bright and inexperienced at harm. I thought of Bob, once the man who knew how to be my champion and now a man who'd bet his honor in a poker game he rigged. That night I drove home with the will under my coat and the thumb drive humming a quiet accusation. I also drove with a plan taking shape. We would not be shrieking headlines. We would be surgical. That is, after all, the sort of revenge that lasts in memory, the sort that people tell at dinner parties with a delighted shiver. I was 2 blocks from my house when a message pinged on my phone, change phones. Use cash. He's onto something. It wasn't from Elise or Bob, it was from my own app. A recording had just uploaded, Bob's voice in the parking lot, irritated and clipped, speaking to someone at work. There's a leak, he said. I think someone's listening. My car felt suddenly too small. My stomach did an uncomfortable flip. He was onto something. Maybe not me specifically, maybe a client, maybe an ex, but he was restless in a way that meant he'd start cleaning. He'd be more careful. He'd replace devices. He'd put passwords where I'd put no trespass signs. I parked and sat with the engine ticking down, listening to that final, dangerous line of the audio again. The world narrowed to a point. If he swapped phones, my little app would be useless. If he grew more careful, opportunities would shrink like puddles in the sun. I had to act faster, smarter. Revenge is a patient thing, but patience without movement is cowardice. So I did what I always do when the world hands me a mess. I called the people I loved. I called Claire first. Her number still started with the Canadian code even after all these years, like a ribbon on a gift I never quite untied. She picked up on the second ring, voice warm and sleepy, as if she'd just woken up to a world that still made sense. I don't think she could have sounded further from the storm that had wrapped itself around my life. "Mama," she said. "Everything okay?" I hate lying. But I love theatrics, so I wrapped the truth in just enough mystery to pull her close. "No," I said. "Everything's not okay. Get on a plane." There are moments when a child's flight feels less like filial duty and more like a rescue mission. Claire was there in 2 days, suitcase full of thrift store chic and a heart as blunt as a cleaver. She arrived with Max, her boyfriend, a patient, sturdy man who loved my daughter like he loved his garden, with the kind of care that involves pruning and patience. He hugged me the first time like he'd been waiting to measure the length of my bones, to make sure I was still sturdy enough to stand on. Then Michael called. He sounded younger than his 32 years when he said, "Mom, you sounded weird on the voicemail. Are you okay?" I told him a shortened version of the wardrobe story, leaving out nothing and not a single flourish. He went silent long enough for me to hear him swallow a lifeline of regret. "I found him," he said finally, voice brittle. 3 days ago, I came back from my gym bag and Dad was in my bed. I froze. I walked out. I didn't want to see him like that, Mom. I didn't want him to know I knew. There are confessions that cut into you like paper and others that heal because they hold truth. Michael's was the kind that hurt and healed. He'd been scarred by surprise, he'd been honest. I told him everything I'd heard, everything I'd recorded. He cried on the phone for 5 minutes, quick, clean sobs, then he said, "Tell me when." "I'll be there." And then closed his mouth with a firmness I recognized as inherited. We met that night around my kitchen table, the same one where I'd taught them to fold napkins into swans and how to hide vegetables in stew so kids will eat them. The 3 of us sat with coffee cooling in mugs and a thumb drive between us like an accusation. "You didn't call the police?" Claire asked, eyes narrow, not because she doubted me, but because she is, by trade and by temperament, a lawyer of tiny domestic matters. "Why not?" "Because I'm greedy," I said, and they laughed, relieved to find the old destiny hiding behind the scandal. "Because I want him to squirm first. Because I want this to land in a way that's fair and brilliant and makes him understand he's been cooking with the wrong heat all these years." We talked like conspirators, which is to say we were practical and petty in equal measure. We drew up 3 goals: protect the restaurant, was our inheritance, ensure Claire and Michael were secure, and find a way to make Bob and Elise accountable without turning my family into a tabloid headline. Revenge, I reminded them, should be tasteful. Even the kind that involves humiliation. Michael, who's always been the operational one, wanted a plan that was surgical. "We need proof," he said. "Not just your voice notes. Paperwork, dates, maybe bank transfers. If he's planning to touch the will, he'll try to make moves. We stop him now." Claire's mind went straight to legal knots she could untie. "We can start by documenting everything you have, Mom," she said. "Then I can draft motions, call the estate attorney. We'll make your will impermeable. And we'll find a way to make the restaurant legally untouchable." She tapped her fingers on the table like chords on a piano ready to be played. We'll also warn the accountant, the bank, put flags on anything suspicious. How do you feel about public exposure? I asked, because there are flavors of revenge and some taste of rotten fish in public shaming. Do we want to drag this into the light? Claire glanced at Michael. He shrugged, the way someone shrugs when they know that light can both burn and reveal. Public, maybe. But controlled. A reveal that's theatrical but not cruel. Think, open letter, a press release when we have the receipts. Make it so his colleagues and customers see the man he really is. Humiliate him in the arena he cares about, the restaurant world. I smiled at that. There is an art to insulting someone in their best shoes. We divided tasks like a well-oiled kitchen brigade. Michael would keep an eye on the restaurant and on any movement of legal paperwork. He'd stage regular, innocent visits to his apartment, laundry runs, gym bag pickups, to look natural and to sniff for telltale signs. Claire would call the estate lawyer, put a temporary hold on any transfers, and make sure my newly notarized will was filed, certified, and backed up in 3 places. She would also have a friendly word with Dr. Manson's office, purely curious inquiries, because lawyers love to ask questions until answers fall out. I took the role I do best, the one who orchestrates and stalks and performs. My job was to be the bait and the eye, to keep an ear to the ground, to read the room where words could be words or weapons. I'd been hiding in closets for a while, apparently, and I'd become good at listening without revealing that I was listening. We also had to think about Elise. She'd been my friend once. That made her betrayal a blade with an engraved name. Claire, practical even with a heart, suggested a meeting, on my terms. Let her know, she said slowly. Make it seem accidental. Have a friendly coffee. See what she says. If she lies, we have her on record. That was a dangerous suggestion only because it relied on courage and on my ability to not scream in someone's face. But I wanted to try it. Part of me longed for the moment where I could look Elise in the eye and see whether her smile carried shame or entitlement. We planned an ambush that looked like an accident. Michael would bump into Elise near her favorite cafe, I would almost spill coffee on her and then they'd talk for 10 minutes while I listened. 10 minutes of conversation could be the difference between a rumor and a conviction. Claire and Max would set up legal trip lines, Michael would act casual and present, I would be the actor, the woman who pretended not to know one of the oldest tricks in the book, how to patiently watch a life untangle. We left the table with roles and with a unity I hadn't felt in a long time. There was an electricity in the room that didn't come from betrayal but from solidarity. It felt oddly like church. Before we dispersed, Michael hesitated. Do you want me to? He started, then stopped. There's always a moment where a child wants to do more than a child can. He wanted to protect me like I'd protected him from scraped knees and bad boyfriends. I held his hand across the table and squeezed. Yes, I said simply. But be honest with me. If you see him, say something. Bring him back to light. We'll handle him in daylight. We hugged then, awkwardly, fiercely. Family has its own grammar of touch. We were a small riot of 3 people who had decided that dignity was worth defending and that sometimes you have to cook the storm down to a sauce so concentrated it stains your memory. That night I slept badly, but not for fear. For the first time since I'd heard Bob's plan from the inside of a wardrobe, I felt a strategy settling in. There would be theater. There would be legal moves. There would, inevitably, be a reckoning that involved laughter and humiliation and perhaps a little public spectacle. I had no interest in cruelty, I wanted clarity, accountability, and for Bob to discover that his appetite for betrayal had a cost. We were, all 3 of us, readying our tools. A family has many tools, money, law, memory, love, and a talented penchant for timing. We'd sharpen them. We'd wait until the pan was hot and then we'd flip him, perfectly cooked, so everyone could see the inside. I picked the cafe because it smelled like burnt sugar and possibility. Elise liked it too, small, mismatched chairs, a barista who wore suspenders and an air of permanent apology. It was the sort of place where people rehearsed their lives aloud, and that suited me. I arrived early, planted myself near the window with a book I wasn't going to read, and waited like a patient predator. Wearing my favorite coat, jade, slightly frayed at the cuffs, the one that makes people assume I have good stories, I watched the street. When Elise appeared, she looked, well, like Elise. Time had done its customary work, softened edges, brightened a laugh. She wore a scarf the color of raspberries and a coat that might have once been mine, which felt like fate or thrift store coincidence. My heart did an absurd, traitorous little thing, it softened. Then it remembered what she and my husband said in my son's bedroom, and the softness hardened into something useful. Michael and Claire were stationed nearby in plain sight. Michael texted me the lock emoji when he sat down across the room. Claire sent a picture of her coffee cup that could have been an encoded war plan. Max was outside, poised like a friendly bouncer. If Elise tried to run, she'd run into a smile that might as well have been a net. I accidentally nearly spilled coffee on her, because I'm a terrible actress who's refined the art of clumsiness into performance. I dropped my cup, slow motion, and the barista's face contorted into an expression normally reserved for dropped soufflés. Elise gasped. I apologized in a tone that suggested embarrassment but not menace. She laughed it off with a grace that made me want to smack her and hug her at the same time. Destiny, she said, the name rolling off her tongue like a secret. She sat as if she owned the space. We talked. 10 minutes stretched like a rubber band, tight and full of potential snap. She was clever in the way small-town girls become clever when city life teaches them how to hide knives and smiles. She asked about my daughter, Claire, like she were checking a weather report. She asked about Michael like he might be an afterthought in a menu. I asked about her life in cautious, ceremonial ways, career, the little tragedies that make people interesting. Everything she said was tidy. At one point she touched my hand, briefly, then pulled back, like a woman who remembered we were once friends and wanted to keep that comfortable distance. Her fingers lingered where the ring would have been, and for the first time the old, small, sharp claim of jealousy rose in me. I realized then that my ring, my grandmother's cabochon, the one I never took off, had been missing for weeks. I'd blamed misplacement and the chaos of living in a house that has hosted 3 generations and 3 dozen casseroles. But I hadn't told anyone. It sat like a quiet accusation in my mind. Then Elise said, Bob's been so distracted lately. Work is demanding, you know? He hasn't been himself. Her voice had the practiced innocence of someone who'd practiced it for a long time. I watched her face for micro-expressions like a bored anthropologist. When someone lies, their eyes either go too still or too lively. Elise's eyes flicked, half apology, half calculation. I let the moment stretch and then I leaned in, smiling because I like smiling when I'm about to be mercilessly kind. You know, I began, I lost something a while back. Maybe you've seen it in a hospital waiting room or a restaurant drawer. It's an old ring, family piece. No big deal. Do you, by any chance, I let the sentence dangle, the way you let a hook wobble in water. Elise's face did a micro-shift. A tiny tightening near the nose, a blink that was not quite natural. She blinked like a woman who has a secret shrimping beneath her blouse. But she recovered immediately, like someone well-practiced at smoothing wrinkles. Oh, Destiny, she said in a tone that suggested pity for my scatterbrained ancestral attachments. I haven't seen anything. I would have told you. If she was lying, she lied fast and smoothly. If she was innocent, she'd offered the kind of performance that could make you feel guilty for suspecting her. I kept my voice light. Funny thing, Bob's been very generous lately. Paying cash for things, small gifts. I suppose it's the season for generosity. She laughed in that way she laughed in my son's bedroom, too intimate for public spaces. My blood cooled. I wanted to reveal everything then and there, the recordings, the will, the humiliating plans. I wanted to shove the thumb drive across the table and watch her color run out like bad dye. But Claire's hand squeezed under the table, a small, affirming pressure. Timing, she reminded me with a look. Timing, I reminded myself. We finished our coffees. I left a tip that would make the barista grin for days, because revenge, like good service, appreciates the theater of gratitude. As Elise walked away, I let a small mound of patience settle in my chest. She had lied, maybe. She had not confessed. That was a thing that could be managed. Afterwards, under the awning, Michael and I shadowed her at a respectful distance while Claire and Max trailed in the cafe's back. I watched Elise cross the street and head towards a building I recognized, a community center where she volunteered cooking classes for the elderly. I felt a complicated sting. She was, apparently, as bright in benevolence as she was in deception. That night we gathered again and compared notes. Michael had snapped a picture of Elise's scarf. Claire had overheard her exchange a text with someone saved under station maintenance. We were building a map made of crumbs. And then an odd thing happened. That evening, while I was folding napkins with the shaky, meditative care of someone planning a dinner, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It read, "Stop digging. He'll know you're listening. Claire's plane? He knows. Be careful. No signature. No niceties." The message smelled of calculation, as if someone had reached into our lives and turned the thermostat up a degree. My stomach dropped in a way that was almost physical, like someone had lifted the corner of a rug and shown me the rats beneath. "Who sent that?" Michael asked, already scanning his own messages like a man checking inventory after a theft. "I don't know," I said. "But someone knows we're moving. Or at least suspects." I kept my voice steady because panic is a poor seasoning. Claire's face went hard as she reached for her laptop. "We need to check logs, IPs, calls. Someone tapped us, or he's paranoid and clever. Either way, he'll change his patterns. We need to move faster. Move faster." The word set a new tempo in me, faster, sharper. We had been cooking with heat that allowed for reduction. Now we had to throw the pan into a blazing oven. Elise had not cracked. Bob was getting nervous. Someone had sent me a warning. The stage was set for escalation. We had crumbs and a whispering threat. The question was, who had the matches? And which part of them would we burn first? The warning text felt like a cold wind through a screen door. Someone knew. Whether it was luck, coincidence, or the thin shadow of guilt prowling through their bed, we couldn't tell. What we could tell was this: Bob had teeth. He'd bitten into something he thought was soft, and now he felt the grit of it in his mouth. We tightened. Claire moved like a lawyer who'd suddenly remembered she was also a tiger, efficient, graceful, and more than a little dangerous. She set up a virtual fortress, two-factor authentication on everything, backup copies of the will, alerts to the bank, and a call to the estate attorney with the sort of voice that made people comply. Michael started sleeping over at his apartment more often, which made his place both less convenient for illicit assignations and more risky for anyone who wanted privacy. Max installed motion sensor lights at our home and befriended our neighbor, an 80-year-old man with a penchant for binoculars and gossip. I called every friend I had who owed me favors, there are always favors, and booked a meeting with a woman at the Historical Society who knew how to dig up old deeds and signatures like a hobby. But practical things can only go so far when treachery tastes like a long game. We needed theater, because theater is public and humiliating in a way that paperwork is not. We needed to make Bob feel small in his largest arena, the restaurant. "People trust their restaurateurs," Claire said one night, hands folded into a jurist's steeple. "Make them see he's untrustworthy." "How?" I asked, because my head was full of sauce and my heart was full of scene. "Smear a bad review? A Yelp crusade won't do it. He needs to be exposed in a place where his peers will notice." Michael grinned, the kind of grin that makes you both proud and mildly frightened. "Chef competitions," he said. "You always told me about the old culinary showdowns Dad loved. What if we arrange something, public? Not to humiliate the staff, but to put him in a position where he's accountable in front of other chefs, suppliers, and customers. If he responds poorly to pressure, well, people watch." I liked that, public, controlled, and elegantly theatrical. We started plotting like chefs, mise en place, every element laid out before the heat hit. Michael would plant the idea of a charity tasting evening at the restaurant through a supplier friend. Claire would quietly tip off a food critic under the guise of a community fundraiser. I would play hostess, always appearing on camera with a smile that suggested I was exactly where I belonged. We'd orchestrate an evening that would highlight Bob's arrogance and reveal his priorities. Not violence, not slander. Just a mirror in which he would see himself and not like the reflection. But before we could light that particular stove, Bob turned the heat in a direction I had not expected. 2 nights later, when the city clings to midnight like a coat on a hook, Michael called me. His voice was clipped and brittle, but there was also a tremor of something else, shame, perhaps, or the cold clarity of someone who'd walked into a place they'd rather not have gone. "He's been slipping her pills," Michael said. The words landed like a slap. "I caught him giving you something." "He told you they were vitamins?" My breath snagged, not because of the news but because of the small logic of it. A man comfortable with paperwork is also comfortable with plausible lies. "What did he give me?" I asked, because the world narrows when your body becomes a suspected crime scene. "Orange pills." "You thought they were vitamins. You were tired from all the running around. You took them." Michael's voice was gentle in a way that betrayed his fear. He couldn't be anything else. "He said Dr. Manson prescribed them. He made you believe you needed them for memory." "But I found the bottle in his sock drawer, Mom. It wasn't labeled like Dr. Manson's. It was labeled with a pharmacy code I don't recognize." I touched the pills with a napkin. "I don't know what they are, but they're not vitamins." I sat down hard, chair clattering like bad china. The room spun a little, not from fear but from the dizzy recognition of how close we'd let him get. "Did you?" I started, but Michael cut me off. "I threw them away," he said. "But he saw me." He laughed. Said I was being dramatic. He didn't look scared. He looked like a man who'd already thought his way out of being caught. Anger is a quick little engine, grief is a slow freight train. Both arrived at once. The pills, whether benign or malevolent, were a gambit. He'd been practicing to make me quiet, compliant, and, unfortunately, docile. For a man plotting to send his wife to a hospice, pilling her was an old, cowardly strategy. "Don't stop," I told Michael. "If he's trying to drug me, then he's nervous. Nervous men make stupid moves. Keep your distance but keep watching. Document everything. If he touches anything he shouldn't, we photograph, we record, we make a paper trail so big it can't be ignored." That night I did something small but deliberate. I called my primary care doctor and asked for a comprehensive checkup. I told the receptionist I was concerned about a new medication. She was kind and practical and scheduled me for blood work the next morning. I didn't want to tell the whole family, fear multiplies when it's fed on rumor, but I wanted the certainty of a lab result. Knowledge, after all, is its own kind of protection. As the week folded into itself, the family's movement became a choreography of small signals, texts coded with coffee cup emojis, meals eaten together more often. My ring finger habitually checked under the table like a superstitious fox. Bob's behavior shifted. He began scheduling business dinners at odd hours. He took more calls in his car. He started hiding things better, a habit of someone who learned the shape of his lies and then tried to slim them into pockets where others couldn't find them. And yet, for all his caution, he could not completely forget the arrogance that had built him. He still believed he was playing on a level of sophistication higher than the rest of us. He still thought his script would hold. That arrogance was the thin seam we planned to pull. One night, as if testing the waters, Bob returned late and found the house lights on. I was at the sink, rinsing a bowl like a woman ennobled by domestic rituals. He stopped in the doorway, looking at me the way a man looks at a painting that's gone slightly askew. "You look, well," he said, the words both compliment and accusation. I smiled at him in the way precise cooks smile at raw meat, neutral, calculating, not a trace of surrender. Working on the party lists, I said. Your son's birthday. Don't tire yourself with worry. We've got it. He laughed, a short bitter sound. You worry too much, Destiny. He crossed the room and leaned in, as if to kiss me. I let him come close enough to smell the soap he liked to buy in bulk. I let him rest for a millimeter of a second. Then I stepped back and watched the expression dissolve on his face. He was measuring me, the way a man tests a dish for seasoning, a pinch of curiosity, a dash of suspicion, a sprinkle of contempt. He left shortly, humming like a man who believed he still knew how the melody went. After he closed the door, I folded my hands and let myself be domestic for a minute longer, like someone who's planning the perfect meal and knows the roll of the thunder outside will be the final seasoning. We were on a tightrope that week, one misstep and the rope could snap. But tightropes make for great theater when you know how to dance. We had evidence, we had will, and we had a family that had decided to be a small, dangerous unit. It was enough to make a plan bloom. And bloom we did. The next move would require a kind of trick that's older than social media but newer than spite. It would require disguises, small lies that smelled like truth, and the kind of public nudge that toppled men who thought themselves steady. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I decided the next step would be equal parts delicious and instructive. Bob had reached for control. It was time to show him what happens when you try to handle someone's life like a casserole meant for spoilage. We moved like a small army of women who'd discovered how loud quiet can be. The charity tasting night, our mise en scene, was no longer just an idea, it was a calendar entry with muscle. Michael's supplier friend had loved the concept, a legacy for local chefs fundraiser, where restaurateurs donated 10-plate tasting menus and proceeds went to a food bank. The restaurant would look heroic hosting it. Bob would look heroic accepting it. Perfect. Claire elevated the plan from spectacle to legal guillotine. She'd spent 3 days on the phone with our estate attorney, who smelled faintly of pipe smoke and righteous indignation. By the time the event rolled around, she'd secured a temporary injunction that prevented any transfer of assets relating to the restaurant or our property without court oversight. The document was real, stamped, and attached to a file folder the size of a small Bible. The attorney promised to have a process server at the event, someone very official who could hand Bob the notice in front of friends, suppliers and, crucially, every food critic in the room. Public, theatrical, unignorable. Serve it with etiquette, Claire said. We don't want him to look like a victim, we want him to look like a man who miscounted his confidences. She smiled in that small lawyer way that meant she was savoring a sentence she'd someday use in an affidavit. We coordinated the press quietly. A critic who loved local drama more than humility agreed to attend under the pretense of covering community philanthropy. Michael worked the staff into place. His aunt, who still hated Bob for forgetting her birthday once, leaned in and offered to help with seating. Max, bless him, handled logistics like a man organizing an army of stuffed animals, calm, impossibly present, and frankly adorable. I flirted shamelessly with the head waiter because old habits die and flattery lubricates operations. I had another, smaller performance scheduled, a plan to recover the ring. It was childish and precious and very, very satisfying. If Elise had been bold enough to think she deserved my grandmother's cabochon, she'd make the mistake of wearing it. People who steal taste to be noticed were trophies. I arranged, through a friend at the antique shop, a vintage brooch that Elise had supposedly been hunting for. It would be the bait in a conversation I could steer toward jewelry and past lovers. I'm old-fashioned enough to enjoy traps that smell faintly of civility. The night came like a curtain being pulled open. The restaurant buzzed, low, confident murmurs, the clacking of glasses, the kind of conviviality that makes conspiracies feel vulgar. Bob stood at the hostess station like a general overseeing a parade. He was beautiful in that tired, smug way men are who practice triumph. He greeted patrons with a smile that had forgotten to be sincere. Elise moved through the room with practiced ease, greeting people like they were characters in a book she already read. Claire's attorney arrived early, the process server in tow, a broad-shouldered woman with a badge and a pen poised like a small sword. I felt like a director watching her take her mark. The recording equipment was set. Michael had hired a tech to feed my voice notes into a looped playback on a tiny speaker in my purse. My gloves hid the device, my smile hid the fury. The first course arrived, an elegant sliver of something that smelled like winter and ambition. The dining room hummed. Cameras clicked politely in corners. Elise came by our table and did the thing friends do, leaned in, kissed my cheek with just enough amusement to sting. "You look radiant tonight," she said, voice sugared and small, as if she were touching a flower. "So do you," I answered, and my hand brushed hers. The cabochon gleamed at her throat, a flash of green like the memory of a summer. My stomach did a tiny diplomatic flip. There it was, my grandmother's stone. Of course she would be foolish enough to wear it where a woman who had the habit of looking would see. I said nothing. I let her bask. All the evidence we needed was not only on drives and in filings, it was here in the living, breathing theater of the restaurant. Then Claire gave our signal, a nearly imperceptible clearing of her throat. The process server stood, buttoned her jacket like armor, and made her way to the podium. The room quieted the way water does when someone mentions a name no one wants to forget. The server read the notice in a voice that carried across linen and leftover laughter. "A temporary injunction has been filed concerning the transfer of assets of this establishment." She announced the attorney's name, the case number, and the fact that the restaurant's operational transfers were now subject to court oversight. The word injunction hit like a bell. A dozen conversations died mid-sentence. Bob's face, practiced and seasoned, registered the smallest betrayal of color. He smiled at first, because smiling is what he does when he hasn't decided whether to be frightened or furious. Then his jaw tightened. People looked at him, their restaurateur, their host. The critic's pen slowed. The murmurs ramped into a low tide. "Ladies and gentlemen," Claire said, stepping to the microphone with a sugar-sweet courtesy that tasted like steel. "We're here to celebrate community. We're also here to uphold truth." She gestured like a lawyer showing a painting. "There are allegations and recordings in this matter. Rather than drag this into rumor, we will provide the community with facts." My phone hummed. A snippet of audio, the one where Bob promised Elise the restaurant and mentioned Dr. Manson, played softly from my purse. It felt like the sound a trap makes when it snaps shut, small, efficient, final. Heads turned. Elise's smile thinned. Bob's hand found hers under the table and gripped like a man who suddenly worries his bones are hollow. "You can't do this," Bob said to Claire, loud enough that the room heard the childishness under his command. "You can't transfer assets while the matter is under review," Claire answered, the lawyer smile now ablade. "Furthermore, we'd like to voluntarily share some recordings that are relevant to the court." She held up a thumb drive like an offering. The critic straightened. The guests leaned in, the evening's warmth turned to a current of interest. Bob moved then, not to deny, but to deny with style. "This is harassment," he said. "These are tricks. You're trying to ruin me on my son's birthday." He plastered on betrayal as if it were a mask that might win sympathy. People looked at me and some of them at him, the way you look at someone wearing an expensive suit and wonder whether the suit fits the man. I stood, a little theatrically, because theater is how I communicate best. I placed my hand on the table, the microphone catching my voice like a net. "This was meant to be a surprise for my son," I said, and the room stilled, not because my confession made them pity me but because it made the scene sharper. "Tonight is also when I learned things that make me grateful for my family and determined on behalf of my father's legacy." Then I removed my gloves. I unbuttoned my coat and reached up to the podium, not to grandstand, but to do one small domestic thing. I lifted a napkin from the table and dusted the cabochon at Elise's throat. She froze, breath caught, eyes darting like a cornered animal. The ring was warm. Too warm. My voice was calm as a well-seasoned pan. "That's my grandmother's ring," I said. "It was missing. I hoped I'd find it in a drawer, but it seems the universe gifted me a name tag." 1,000 little looks passed between people, curiosity, disbelief, that delicious human hunger for scandal. Elisa's face paled in a brilliant, theatrical way. Bob opened his mouth and then closed it because this time there was a legal folder in his periphery and cameras and witnesses and reasons why denials would dim. He started to laugh like a man who wants to be brave and sounds like a child. "You can't prove," he began. Claire smiled in the way that ends arguments. "We can," she said. "And we will." Phones lit up across the room as people reached for their devices, some for notes, some for proof, some for the giddy certainty that tonight would be one for retelling. I felt the heat of adrenaline not as panic but as a clarifying light. The plan was working. The injunction was public. The recordings were imminent. The ring was visible and incriminating. And then, as if the universe liked an encore, Elisa's hand flew to her throat and knocked the cabochon loose. The stone clattered to the table between us like a confession. For one heartbeat the room was the sound of silverware and stunned air. Everyone saw it. Everyone heard it. My grandmother's green stone spun on the linen like a planet finding orbit. Elisa's mouth opened. Bob's face crumpled in a way that made him look suddenly breakable. He stood, voice sharp with a danger I'd never wanted to meet. "You'll regret this," he said, and there was a real, low threat in it. But under the threat, audible to me, to my children, to a critic, to the process server, there was panic. "Sir," the process server said softly, "hand already out, you are hereby served." The room exhaled as if a long-held breath had been put down like a tray. Glasses clinked, not in celebration but in the sick, civilized noise of a crowd witnessing a private life unloaded in public. Elisa's eyes met mine, no more friend, no more pretense, only the rawness of someone exposed. The night had become a courtroom and a theater and a family reunion all at once. I stood there with my hand still on the napkin and thought of small things, my father's laugh in the kitchen, the way he'd taught me to check a sauce for seasoning, the way he'd kept his ledgers with the tenderness of a man caring for an old instrument. The next act was already beginning, the files, the legal filings, the press calls, and the part one loved most, the reckoning. But as we watched Bob being handed a document that might undo his plans, I felt something else bloom in me, a fierce, quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with justice in plain view. The ring spun to a stop on the linen, and the room buzzed like a hive that had just been kicked. I didn't need to say anything more, the evidence had said it for me. But silence is sometimes more powerful than fury, so I just picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip. A toast to betrayal caught in daylight. Bob's face was a study in bad improvisation. He had always prided himself on being quick with words, fast enough to schmooze suppliers, charming enough to seduce women, clever enough to sell any lie. But in that moment, with the cabochon glinting under the lights, he looked like a man whose script had been stolen and replaced with blank pages. The process server's papers weighed heavy in his hand. He stuffed them into his jacket pocket like contraband. Elise, meanwhile, pressed her lips together so tightly I thought she might bite through her own lies. She clutched her scarf as if a piece of fabric could hide a lifetime of shameless choices. The critic, bless his ink-stained little soul, leaned back in his chair and scribbled like a man who'd just stumbled into Shakespeare in the park. He wouldn't need to exaggerate a single word, the drama was doing its own work. I leaned toward the microphone again, smiling at the audience like a hostess who knew dessert was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, "forgive the interruption. Betrayal is a poor appetizer, but justice makes for a fine main course. Please enjoy your evening." The applause was polite, cautious, and tinged with that giddy awe that comes when respectable society realizes they've just been handed gossip with a bow. Bob tried to say something, his lips formed the beginnings of misunderstanding, but Claire was already on her feet, shepherding the critic toward our table, offering him a neat summary of injunctions and inheritance law that would make a courtroom cheer. Michael slipped into the kitchen to check on the staff, making sure they weren't collateral damage in his father's implosion. He reported back a few minutes later, whispering in my ear, "They're with us. They've seen enough. Most of them suspected already." That warmed me. A kitchen knows its master better than anyone. If they were with us, then Bob's empire was already rotting from the inside out. And yet, Bob didn't crumble. Not entirely. Men like him rarely do at first. He smoothed his tie, summoned a smile that looked painted on with a shaky brush, and began making rounds at the tables, pretending nothing had happened. He laughed too loud, gestured too wide, and poured wine like he was drowning in it. His performance was desperate, but desperation has an audience too. Everyone saw it. Everyone clocked the panic. I didn't follow him. I stayed seated, my hands folded neatly, my smile steady. The strength of a woman isn't in chasing the spectacle but in being unshakable while the spectacle chases her. Later, when the last dessert plate had been cleared and the critics were gone, Bob stormed into the kitchen. Michael and I followed. Elise trailed behind like a shadow losing its form. He slammed a ladle onto the counter, metal shrieking. "You've ruined me," he hissed, eyes darting from me to our son. "Do you think this will hold? Do you think a few papers and some cheap tricks will undo me? I built this place." "No," I said, calm as cream. "My father built it. You polished the silverware and called it yours." He lunged, not at me but at the nearest pan, grabbing it as though he might fling it. Michael stepped forward, his voice sharp, "Don't even think about it." For the first time in his life, my son's voice made his father pause. That pause was more delicious than any soufflé I'd ever pulled from an oven. Elise tried to intervene. "Bob, stop," she said, voice trembling. But she didn't sound like a lover then, she sounded like a woman realizing she'd backed the wrong horse. I leaned in just enough to let my words land like salt in a wound. "This is only the beginning, Bob. Papers tonight, hearings tomorrow, and the truth the day after. You should get used to this flavor, it's the taste of consequences." He looked at me with something feral in his eyes, then shoved the pan back onto the stove and stormed out the back door into the alley. Elise hesitated for 1 second, then followed, heels clicking like punctuation marks on a bad essay. The kitchen fell silent. A busboy crossed himself. One of the line cooks muttered, "About damn time." I exhaled, slow and steady. Then I turned to Michael. "Well, darling," I said. "That was Act 1. Tomorrow we write Act 2. And Act 2, in my mind, was already crystal clear. If Bob thought public shame was the end of it, he hadn't yet tasted what it meant for his own family to become his fiercest adversaries. Act 2 began not with shouting or police sirens but with the quiet thrum of plotting around my kitchen table again. That table had become our war council, the altar where betrayal was dissected and turned into strategy. Claire spread papers like maps of a battlefield, Michael drummed his fingers with the restless energy of a man itching to strike, and Max made tea like a soldier polishing boots. "We've shaken him," Claire said. "He's rattled." "That's good. But rattled men lash out. We need to anticipate." Michael leaned forward. "We can't just defend anymore. We've got to hit him where it hurts. Publicly. Repeatedly. He needs to know that every time he tries to take a step, we'll be there to trip him." I smiled, because my boy had finally learned the art of elegant vengeance. "So what's the play, darling?" Michael's grin was wicked. "We stage the affair. On our terms. We control the narrative. Make them think they're clever, when in reality we're the ones pulling strings." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Michael continued, "we let Dad and Elise walk into a trap of their own making. They've been using my apartment for their Tuesday through Thursday rendezvous, right? We turn it into a stage. Cameras, microphones, the works. Next time they slither in, we get everything on tape, his promises, her complicity, the whole disgusting plan. Then we release it, controlled, careful, just enough to scorch them but not us." "Blackmail?" Claire asked. "Exposure," I corrected. "We won't demand anything. We'll just shine a very bright light." The more we talked, the better it sounded. Michael had the tech connections, Claire knew how to handle evidence so it couldn't be dismissed in court. Max offered to help wire the place. He'd apparently once set up surveillance for a wildlife study, and I nearly kissed him on the cheek for the poetry of it. Betrayal caught like raccoons on a trail cam. I, of course, claimed the role I was born for, director of timing. Because nothing kills drama like bad pacing. The plan was simple. 1. Wire Michael's apartment with discreet cameras and audio recorders. Nothing flashy, just enough to catch the truth in living color. 2. Lure them back, make sure Bob couldn't resist his Tuesday or Thursday habit. I'd make myself conveniently busy those evenings, dropping hints about errands or visits that would leave the house empty. 3. Let them perform, because cheaters always perform when they think they're safe. 4. Release the footage strategically, not to tabloids, but to the exact people whose opinion Bob valued most: investors, suppliers, and the restaurant community. Nothing ruins a man like betrayal exposed to the very people who trusted him. As we finalized the plan, I couldn't help but chuckle. "We're about to make your father the star of his own cooking show," I said. "Except instead of top chef, it's top fool." Michael laughed until tea nearly came out his nose. Claire just shook her head, muttering, "You're unbelievable, Mom." But here's the thing, I wasn't unbelievable. I was inevitable. The following Tuesday, the stage was set. Cameras hidden in vents, mics tucked into lamp bases, a signal booster disguised as a router. Michael had done excellent work. It looked like nothing more than a bachelor's slightly messy apartment. We didn't sit inside the closet this time. We sat 3 blocks away in my Jeep, laptop open on Claire's knees, the live feed crackling in. Max had popcorn, because why not, and Michael kept muttering like a sports commentator. At 7:42 p.m., the door opened. Bob walked in, Elise on his arm. She was laughing, head thrown back, exactly as she had in the recordings. They kissed, clumsy and greedy, as though betrayal was an aphrodisiac. And then Bob began to talk. Oh, how he talked. About the restaurant, about the new will, about how soon he'd be free of obligations. Every word a nail in his coffin. Elise chimed in, careless, arrogant, describing how she'd redecorate the place once it's ours. Claire's lips curled into a predator's smile. We've got them. We've got everything. I watched the screen, equal parts fury and satisfaction coiling in me. There they were, plotting my erasure in my son's bed. And there we were, recording every syllable. For once, their arrogance had served us. When they finally collapsed into silence, Michael closed the laptop with a flourish. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we've just captured Exhibit A." We drove home in silence, each of us savoring the win. But I knew better than to celebrate too early. Bob wasn't finished, not yet. Men like him never are. And sure enough, 2 days later, he made his next move. He placed a small orange pill bottle by my bedside, right on top of my book, as if it belonged there. He smiled that awful smile and said, "Don't forget your vitamins, darling." I picked it up, shook it gently, and smiled right back. "Oh, I won't." But what he didn't know was that I'd already scheduled a lab test, and the results were due any day now. If those pills were poison disguised as medicine, I'd have more than betrayal on my side. I'd have evidence of attempted murder. And evidence, unlike love, doesn't lie. The lab results came back in a plain white envelope, no drama at all, until I tore it open and felt my pulse trip over itself. Claire sat beside me at the kitchen table, pen poised as if she were ready to cross-examine the paper itself. Michael hovered near the fridge, pretending to drink juice straight from the carton. Inside, on sterile letterhead, was the truth: the orange pills were not vitamins. They contained a cocktail of sedatives, barbiturates, strong enough to cloud memory, disorient thought, and, if taken regularly, create the perfect illusion of dementia. "Well," I said, exhaling slowly, "Bob really did want me drooling in a hospice." Michael slammed the fridge door so hard the magnets rattled. "I'll kill him," he muttered. Claire reached for my hand. "No," she said firmly. "That's what he expects, that we'll fight him dirty. But we're smarter. We'll make him choke on his own lies. The sedatives were dynamite. Suddenly this wasn't just infidelity, it was attempted erasure. If we played our cards right, he wouldn't just lose the restaurant, he'd lose his reputation, maybe even his freedom. Let's not rush, I told them, though my chest burned with rage. The footage we took already shows intent. Now we've got proof of method. We combine the two, and Bob writes his own obituary. That night, we rewatched the recording from Michael's apartment, this time with fresh ears. Every sly mention of me being taken care of, every slimy whisper about how Elise would take her rightful place in the kitchen, now sounded like Exhibit B to the pills Exhibit A layered together. They formed a symphony of betrayal so loud it could drown out even Bob's smoothest denials. Claire tapped her laptop. Here's what we do. We cut a short reel, 2 minutes max. Him promising Elise the restaurant, him talking about sending you to Canada, and a shot of the ring she was wearing. Add subtitles so no one misses a word. Then we send it to every investor, every supplier, and every food critic in the state. Anonymous email. Clean trail. Michael leaned forward. And the pills? That, Claire said, go straight to the district attorney. Quietly. Once they open a file, Dad won't just have a scandal, he'll have a case. Max, bless his practical heart, chimed in, but don't you want to see their faces when the reel drops? Like, actually see them watch it? I grinned. Oh, I do. Nothing sweeter than watching liars realize the room knows the truth. So we made a plan for Act 3 of the theater. The restaurant would host its monthly wine-pairing dinner, with all the usual suspects in attendance, investors, suppliers, critics, and half the city's self-proclaimed foodies. Bob would strut like a peacock, Elise would hover like a moth near flame, and we, his so-called family, would deliver the final dish, humiliation a la mode. In the days leading up to it, Bob became almost unbearably smug. He believed the injunction was a bluff, Elise's theft of my ring a coincidence, and my silence a victory. He even whistled around the house, like a man who thought the storm had passed. Poor Destiny, he'd say, patting my hand in that condescending way. You worry too much. You should let me handle things. Oh, I will, I replied sweetly. You'll handle things just fine. And on the night of the dinner, he did handle his own destruction, that is. The room sparkled with glasses, laughter, and the kind of shallow compliments men like Bob thrive on. He toasted investors, winked at Elise, and moved from table to table like a king presiding over loyal subjects. But when dessert was served, chocolate torte with raspberry glaze, Michael slipped a USB into the projector system. The lights dimmed. The screen at the far end of the room flickered to life. First came the audio, Bob's voice, low and unmistakable. Half a year from now I will marry you. We'll send my wife to a hospice. The restaurant will be mine. I'll make you the chef. A ripple of gasps broke across the room. Elise's fork clattered to her plate. Bob froze mid-stride, his wineglass hovering uselessly in the air. Then the video, grainy, but clear enough. Him, in Michael's apartment, promising Elise a future built on my grave. Her, wearing my grandmother's ring, laughing like treachery was a love song. The subtitles scrolled beneath their voices. Every damning word spelled out in black and white. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that swallows reputations whole. Bob dropped his glass. It shattered, spraying wine like blood across the linen. Elise's face turned the color of the torte glaze. And I, sitting calmly at my table with Claire and Michael beside me, raised my water glass and gave a small, deliberate toast. To the truth, I said. The projector clicked off. The lights came up. And the entire room turned to look at Bob, not as their host, but as a fraud. The silence after the video ended was heavier than any scream. Forks lay abandoned, half-filled glasses trembled in hands, and Bob stood center stage like a magician whose final trick had just revealed his pockets stuffed with dead rabbits. Ladies and gentlemen, he tried, his voice breaking on the first syllable, this is doctored, some sick. But he didn't get further. The critic, the same ink-stained fellow from the charity night, rose slowly, pen poised like a dagger. "Doctored?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "I've heard plenty of lies in this business, Bob, but none so sloppy as this. The voice is yours. The ring is hers. And the arrogance? Well, that's unmistakable." The room murmured. Investors whispered. One supplier actually stood, muttering about contracts and trust. Elise shrank in her chair, scarf pulled high like a child hiding behind curtains. She looked around as though someone might save her, but all she saw were eyes narrowing like shutters closing. Bob's smile collapsed. His mask had cracked, and beneath it was the real man, sweaty, furious, cornered. He slammed a fist onto the table, rattling glasses. "This is a setup. My own family is trying to destroy me. You can't believe this." I stood then, slow and steady, every inch of me calm. "Your family isn't destroying you, Bob," I said. "You're destroying yourself. We're just letting the world see." And oh, how the world saw. Phones had been raised. Videos had been recorded. Within hours, clips of his face, white as a flour sack, twisted with panic, would be bouncing across social media, served up with hashtags like #hospicehusband and #chefoflies. Elise bolted first. She grabbed her purse, shoved her chair back, and fled out the side door, heels clacking like a retreat drum. Someone laughed as it shut behind her. Bob tried to salvage dignity, straightening his tie, forcing a chuckle. "She's unstable," he said. She's been obsessed with me for years. I tried to help her, but..." Michael stood then, tall, broad, his voice clear. "Don't lie about her now, Dad. We all saw the video. We all heard you. Own it." Bob's jaw clenched. His eyes darted from me to our son, to Claire, who had her phone raised not to film but to email, because she was already sending the pill report to the district attorney's office. Within 48 hours, things moved quickly. The DA's office opened a preliminary investigation. The pills, tested, logged, and confirmed, were evidence of a planned incapacitation. Not quite enough for attempted murder yet, but more than enough for reckless endangerment and fraudulent concealment. Bob's investors began pulling out, one by one, like rats abandoning a ship on fire. Suppliers demanded payment in cash, citing uncertainty. The restaurant, once a stage, became a hollow echo of its old self. And Elise? Poor, foolish Elise. Within a week, her name appeared in every column. The mistress who wore another woman's ring. She gave one interview, tearful, claiming she'd been misled. But the internet was merciless. Her cooking classes at the community center dried up, even old friends stopped calling. She became a ghost in a raspberry scarf. As for Bob, the DA summoned him for questioning. He strutted into that courthouse as though he still had power, cameras flashing, his tie perfectly knotted. But the headlines told the truth: respected restaurateur under investigation for drugging wife. Michael, Claire, Max, and I sat at home that evening, wine glasses in hand, watching it all unfold on the evening news. Michael raised his glass. "To family," he said, his voice steady but bright. Claire added, "And to karma." I smiled. "And to patience," I said. "The sweetest revenge is slow-cooked." We clinked glasses, and for the first time in months, I felt not betrayed but vindicated. Bob wasn't gone yet, but his empire was crumbling, his name turning sour on every tongue. And I wasn't finished. Because if there's one thing a woman like me knows, it's that the final blow should be the most unforgettable. And I had just the recipe. If patience is a spice, then I had been marinating for months. I'd let the heat do its work while Claire basted the legalities, Michael prepped the tech mise en place, and Max, dear practical Max, handled the logistics like a man who believes life should be tidy and well labeled. But now it was my turn to plate the thing in a way nobody would forget. I wanted the ending to taste like justice and lemon, sharp, cleansing, and impossible to ignore. The plan was simple in theory and beautiful in practice. We'd invite every stakeholder who mattered: investors, suppliers, critics, the mayor's office, and the very patrons who had once toasted Bob as if he were the city's culinary saint, to a grand legacy night. The public invitation read like an ode, celebrating the restaurant's heritage, honoring community partnerships, and announcing a new chapter. They would come because food people come to food, it's in our bones. Bob would come because he loved stages the way some men love power. He would be there to accept accolades. He would, no doubt, believe he had won back legitimacy. He believed because he had always believed in his own narrative. And men who write their future in ink designed to hide the truth make the best protagonists in a public unmasking. On the appointed night, the dining room smelled like rosemary and nerves. The staff were in on it. They moved with a choreography that only people who have worked in kitchens for decades can achieve: quiet, efficient, and wholeheartedly loyal. Michael had prepared the menu that would be printed and then ceremonially altered. Claire ensured the press packets were in order. Max had arranged for a small stage in the back of the dining room where the ceremony would occur. I wore the jade coat again because some objects are talismans and some garments are flags. We played every card at once. The critics were here. The city council member who had been kind to my father's charity dinners was seated in the front row. The process server from the Injunction came wearing sensible shoes and a face that said she'd seen worse and would serve anyone in a courtroom. Most importantly, the DA's deputy, discreet but grim, took a seat near the back. Bob arrived on schedule, smile glossy as a fondue pot. Elise clung to his arm like a desperate garnish. He moved through the room like he owned the hum of it. He took center stage with the kind of ease that comes when you've practiced smiling for years into the right mirrors. The ceremony began with syrupy praise for the restaurant's legacy. I listened and let the flattery coat me like something I'd known how to iron out for years. Then, with the timing of a maitre d' presenting the final course, Claire stepped up to the mic. "Tonight," she said, voice cool and public, "is a night of stewardship. It is also a night for transparency." At her signal, Michael dimmed the lights, and the projector behind the podium came to life. We showed a 2-minute compilation, not the full reel, but the most damning parts: Bob's promises, his casual talk of moving me out of the way, Elise's comfortable acceptance of it all. No commentary. No editorializing. Just their voices, their words, and the ring, my grandmother's cabochon, looming like an apostrophe in the footage. The room went very quiet. You could hear the clink of a spoon in the back kitchen, like a small, guilty metronome. Bob's face changed color in the way good porcelain does under hot light. He sputtered his rehearsed denial, but this time the crowd didn't buy the performance. People who had stayed loyal to him because of the glow of his name now felt that glow fade like a bulb sputtering out. That was only the first course. Before he could regain composure, the process server rose and walked, with the kind of dignity the law gives itself, to the podium. She read aloud, in a voice that carried to the farthest table, the court's new order: immediate temporary transfer of operational control to the executor, my son, a freeze on any asset transfers, and an order to surrender any company credit accounts pending full hearing. The papers were real, stamped, signed. The deputy DA stood up then and formally announced that the pill report had been forwarded to their office and that an investigation for reckless endangerment and related charges was underway. It is one thing to lose a reputation, it is something else entirely to watch the people you thought were your pillars hand you the ladder to climb out of the pit you dug. Investors exchanged numbers, suppliers scribbled notes, and the murmurs transformed into murmurs with teeth. Bob turned on me then, real, hot, male fury. "You set me up," he roared, and his voice had the exact wrong timbre for a man used to commanding kitchens. It cracked like thin caramel. "You ruined me, my life." I felt the heat of his outrage and replied, cool as a plated sorbet. "I saved my life, Bob. You tried to steal it." That line landed like a knife in soft butter. People love a tidy juxtaposition, a wife standing calm while a husband unspools. Elise looked as if she might faint. Someone called a manager. In the press packet, Claire had included copies of the lab report proving the pills, the thumb drive, and a notarized copy of the revised will. Everything it took to show motive, opportunity, and method sat in neat stacks like proof that the world can be ordered. Bob didn't collapse that night. Men like him try to preserve dignity even as they fall. But the scaffolding of his life, credit lines, supplier trust, investor faith, began to creak. A major supplier quietly excused itself from their weekly shipment, a restaurateur friend asked him to step down from their regional board, and a local paper's headline the next morning called the whole affair a collapse of flavors and character. I'd planned one more touch, because theatricality pleasures me and because some lessons belong to the personal. After the formal announcements, while the photographers buzzed and the DA's deputy spoke to a reporter, I asked to speak to the room. "I'd like to make a dedication," I said. "To my father, who taught me that a legacy is not a trophy but a promise to your community." I paused so people could lean in, because the best sentences are those that let the audience arrange themselves around them. "And to remind the world, a legacy must be defended." My gaze found Bob's across the room. He glared like a man unable to recognize his life in the mirror. Then I did something only a woman with very old manners and very new cunning would do. I walked across the room to him. The cameras pivoted, because cameras will always follow the woman who takes action. I stopped in front of him and held up my hand, showing the empty finger with the gentleness of someone demonstrating a lost thing. The jade coat in the light looked like a flag lowered in triumph. "Return what you stole," I said. "Publicly." A murmur rippled. Elise made a noise that might have been a wail. Bob's face flushed a deep, angry red. He reached into his jacket, clumsy, like a man unaccustomed to admitting guilt, and produced my grandmother's ring. He had kept it in his pocket like a grotesque talisman. He presented it with a gesture that might have been apology if apology could be purchased with a stolen heirloom. I took the ring and placed it back on my finger. The gesture was small, but the symbolism was enormous. The room applauded, not for me but for the ritual of returning what belonged to the past. Elise, humiliated and shrinking, slipped out with the speed of someone who has become suddenly invisible. Bob left that night with an escort from his attorney, the sort of man who talks in short, blunt sentences and whose tie gives away panic more honestly than the man wearing it. He was not arrested that night. Criminal proceedings take time, but the professional scaffolding that propped him up was gone. They say reputation takes years to build and seconds to demolish. In his case, a few nights and a projector did the job. I drove home with the ring warm on my finger and a tired kind of triumph in my bones. The restaurant would be in legal limbo for months, the DA would do its work, the court would sift through motive and opportunity and evidence. I did not gloat. Gloating is for the small-minded. Instead, I savored a quiet, well-earned pleasure, the knowledge that I had done what my father would have done, defended a legacy with wit, nerve, and an appetite for truth. There's a smallness in all this that is delightful. His name, once spoken with reverence, was now a cautionary tale. People told the story like a recipe: measure a man's hubris, add a pinch of evidence, simmer until the gossip thickens. They would tell it with the kind of relish usually reserved for good pie. I went to bed that night thinking of endings. Not the violent ones, not the ones that leave bodies in the road, but the ones where people get exactly what their choices deserve: consequence, exposure, and the loss of the comfortable stages upon which they strut. The city has a way of rearranging itself after a small scandal, like a table reset between courses. By morning the headlines leaned toward inevitability: renowned restaurateur under investigation, family alleges drugging scheme. Social feeds bloomed with clipped audio and side-by-side photos of a man who had always loved the light. There was a peculiar satisfaction in seeing a life polished to gleam finally show the tarnish beneath. But true endings are quieter than headlines. They happen over paperwork and phone calls and small, private reckonings. The DA called for follow-up interviews. The estate attorney filed motions. The injunction was extended. Bob, the man who once sashayed through suppliers and mayors, spent his days answering questions from men with short haircuts and less patience than he'd ever known. Elise, left with a reputation that zips and stings, moved away from her teaching, the community center suddenly silent to her name. We didn't dance on the ruins. That would be crass. Instead, we attended to what mattered: mending, reassessing, and rebuilding. Michael took interim control of the restaurant's operations with a quiet competence that made his former employees breathe easier. He kept the kitchen honest, simple, good food, staff paid on time, because that is what my father had believed in. Claire handled the legal fallout with a surgeon's grace. She placed temporary fiduciary oversight in the hands of a neutral trustee, secured payroll, and set up a fund to protect employees from the sudden financial tremor. Max, who'd baked more than a few cookies for us during strategy sessions, became the unofficial morale officer, stocking the pantry with treats and insisting the staff take Sunday afternoons to rest. And me? I returned to small rituals, folding napkins, testing gravies, sitting on my porch with a mug of tea that tasted like childhood. I spoke with friends who called for the pleasure of gossip but stayed for the comfort. I walked the block where my father had once stood, remembering the ledger he'd keep under his arm like a talisman. Sometimes I would open that old ledger, now safely filed, and read his handwriting, his small careful accounts that told of someone who tended life like a garden. It steadied me. There were hard things, of course. Bob bought silence from a few people, paying to make injuries hush in corners where money buys the quiet. The law, we discovered, is patient and slow. It can unspool a man's schemes, but it does not always deliver the quick cruelty our private fantasies demand. There were also private losses to account for: friends who took sides, community events rearranged, the awkward pauses when acquaintances saw me and didn't know whether to hug or avert their eyes. But the sweetest justice doesn't come from ruin alone. It comes from correction. We set the restaurant up with a board that included Claire, Michael, and 2 local community members, people who knew the place not as a brand but as a promise. We re-established scholarships in my father's name for culinary students from working-class backgrounds, and we started a small fund to help older workers in the neighborhood who needed medical or financial assistance. Each check we cut felt like a stitch sewn back into the fabric Bob had tried to tear. One afternoon, sometime after the DA had filed charges for reckless endangerment and a pending hearing was noted for intent, I found myself back in Michael's apartment. The room still smelled faintly of lemon oil and youth. The wardrobe where I'd first heard those monstrous words had been moved, an old piece of furniture with a new scar of memory, but it was no longer a prison. I opened it and smiled at the neat row of coats, at the memory of the tiny, dangerous theater that had once fit inside it. "Destiny," Michael said, leaning in the doorway. He had that tentative look new to the role of someone who holds a business and a family at once. "Do you ever," he didn't finish, "miss being naive?" I supplied. He laughed. "No. Miss how small things used to be." His voice softened. Thank you. For being unbearable enough to keep going." I hugged him then, the way you hug someone who has learned how to stand. Claire joined us after a minute, and the 3 of us stood in that cramped apartment like a tribe that had weathered something and come out meaner, kinder, and oddly together. People asked me afterward why I didn't make Bob pay more. Why I didn't make the scandal bigger. Why I didn't throw fireworks. My answer was always the same: I wanted him to lose what mattered to him, not merely in spectacle, but in consequence. He'd stolen trust, manipulated medicines, and planned a life on the bones of other people. He deserved to see the result of those choices in the world he'd tried to play. He lost his professional respect, his lover, and the quiet assumption of privilege that keeps certain men comfortable. The law would chew the rest. As for Elise, she reached out once, a letter full of the kind of contrition that felt practiced and slightly thin. I read it and folded it like a napkin. There are apologies and there are reckonings. The latter requires both humility and time. I remain open to both, but I will not be rushed into forgiveness like some impulse purchase. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about the voice in that wardrobe, the soft, confident voice that promised a hospice and a ring and a chef's hat. There is a lesson in all of that, and I like to think I learned it well. Never assume ownership of another's life. Never underestimate the stubbornness of a woman who knows her worth. Never imagine you can erase someone with pills and paperwork. The channel, oh yes, the channel. Her karma grew a little after the scandal, because people love a twist served honestly. I posted one video, short and sweet, about legacy and dignity. I never named names, the law made that unwise. Instead I told a story about a woman, a restaurant, and the things worth defending. The comments were full of other women offering stories and recipes and, sometimes, a good piece of gossip. We became a small community bound by the idea that dignity is not fragile, it's defended. If you were to ask me now whether I enjoyed the revenge, I'd answer with the truth I've learned after 60 years. It's not the revenge that sustains you, it's the reclaiming. It's the restoration of what was rightfully yours, your name, your memories, your father's recipes. It's the rebuilding of trust with your children, the stitches we sew when life unravels. The law will do its slow work. The court will parse intent and evidence, and men who thought themselves untouchable will learn the small, humiliating truths about accountability. Meanwhile, the restaurant will continue to feed people, simple stews, honest bread, a pastry that my father would have nodded at approvingly. As for me, I keep the jade coat, the one that's seen a few storms. I keep the ring on my finger, not as a trophy but as a reminder that what's handed down to you is not merely ornament, it's responsibility. I still sign off my little videos with a wry smile. If you're listening, remember, karma prefers to be well-dressed. People laugh. They send me recipes. They tell me their secrets, and sometimes, when it's safe, they thank me for telling my story. In the end, the grand revenge was not a dramatic collapse but a careful, precise reclaiming. It's quieter, kinder, and better seasoned. And when I walk through the restaurant now, I watch Michael move among the staff with a hands-on calm that is both tender and exacting. He is not the boy who avoided confrontations, he is a man who chooses to do right. If you've sat through this whole confession, you know the rest, life goes on. There are anniversaries, and there are meals, and there are small desserts shared with friends who become family. There are also mornings I wake up grateful to be precisely who I was, flawed, furious at times, but never willing to be erased. So that is how it ended, not with a bang, but with a ledger closed properly, a will that stayed true, and a family that discovered its backbone. If you subscribe to her karma, you'll see more, recipes, musings, and, when necessary, a story about what it looks like when a woman refuses to go quietly. My name is Destiny. I have been wronged and I have answered. I did not break. I rebuilt. And if you ever wonder whether an ordinary woman can rewrite her story, trust me, she can, and she will.